3 years ago, a miracle happened on the television show Britain's Got Talent when 15-year-old Kyle Tomlinson took the stage for his audition. For those of you who are not familiar with the show, it is similar to the television programs like Star Search or America's Got Talent, where people perform for audiences and a panel of professional judges who judge whether or not the performer has talent. Sometimes the judges can be snarky and just downright cruel, which is part of the reason why some people watch programs like this. But sometimes they can be something like a miracle. And that is what happened when Kyle Tomlinson stood before the judges and told them that he had been there before when he was 12 years old. Apparently, his performance at that time had not been very good, and one of the judges told him to get a voice teacher. But the judge didn't do it in an encouraging way. In fact, the judge had sounded mean at the time. And that same judge was there the day of Kyle's audition, and the audience and the other judges let him know they didn't think that was okay. The other judges, including the infamous Simon Cowell, told Kyle they were all there to support him and to go ahead with his song when he was ready. And after a dramatic pause, Kyle launched into a passionate performance of Leonard Cohen's song, Alleluia. It was so heartfelt. You could see tears in the eyes of the judges and the audience members who applauded the young singer. But that isn't what made that moment a miracle. The audience didn't just applaud. They were somehow with Kyle. They visibly and audibly responded when he changed key or tempo. The way they paid attention lifted him up. And when he finished singing, not only did he receive a standing ovation, well, there were tears in his own eyes. And after the song, the judges told Kyle how wonderful he was and how courageous he was to return after being told he wasn't good enough and after working hard, prove the person who had misjudged him wrong. And that is when the judge, who had been mean to Kyle a few years ago, must have been swept up in the love that was so palpable in that place, and pushed the button that meant Kyle was coming back as a contestant. And there were fresh tears of happiness all around. When I first watched that clip from Britain's Got Talent on YouTube, I found tears streaming down my face because I was so deeply moved. And it wasn't the song that moved me. It was not the performance of the singer. It was the people who were paying such rapt attention to the brave young man who was humble and honest, and it was how everyone found a way to be present with him while he literally sang his heart out. He wasn't standing alone, performing on a stage. Instead, it felt more liturgical to me, more communal. Somehow, in the sharing of his story, Kyle had created a community that was with him, that wouldn't let him fail. In a time when I see so much criticism, so much vitriol, so much cynicism, so much anger, and so much cruelty. This video was the reminder I needed that sometimes we human beings are not cruel. Sometimes, every now and again, we can be the beloved community God intended us to be. And when that happens, it is so deeply beautiful, so deeply moving, so deeply connected, it can feel like a miracle. Like the time Jesus walked on water in the middle of a storm. Today's gospel is one of those well-known miracle stories of Jesus. Most sermons on this text usually focus on Jesus and Peter walking on the water. And that's not a surprise, because that's where so much of the energy and powerful emotions are. But today, maybe it would be a good idea to remember the other people in the story, those 11 other disciples in the boat. At the beginning of today's gospel, we read that Jesus made the disciples get into a boat without him while he went off somewhere else by himself to pray. Evidently, he would catch up with them later. While the disciples were crossing a lake, a storm started that apparently was severe enough to wear out even the most seasoned fishermen in the group. Then, early in the morning, while the storm was still waging on, after hours and hours of being battered by the waves of the storm, the disciples saw something in the distance. We know it was Jesus walking on the water, but they didn't. Today's gospel said they didn't even recognize him. Maybe they were too exhausted, or maybe it never occurred to them that someone would be out in such weather, let alone walking on the stormy water without a boat. Either way, it's important to note they didn't recognize Jesus until he called out to them and told them to not be afraid. Now, we aren't told how all the disciples responded to this message. We are told Peter responded by asking Jesus if it was him to call him to join him on the water. Now, quite often, Peter is given a lot of criticism for asking to join Jesus on the waves. Some scholars and commentators say Peter was just, too enthusiastic, too eager to rise above himself, and he should have let Jesus be Jesus and stayed on the boat. But I disagree with them. If it had been wrong for Peter to walk on the water, I am sure Jesus would have told him so. Instead, Jesus called to Peter to walk on the water with him, and in so doing, I believe, showed something important to those disciples in the boat. While I do agree that there is only one Jesus and none of us is him, I also feel Jesus wasn't trying to show off that he was Lord over all creation when he went walking on the water in the gospel. Instead, I believe he was showing his disciples that when they felt afraid and felt far away from him, he came to them to be near them in the very thing they were afraid of, the storm. Now, I'm not saying Jesus sent that storm, but that is where he chose to be. And there's something for us to consider when those life storms like global pandemics and racism rear their ugly heads and we can feel battered by the waves. Perhaps in the tension of those life storms is where Jesus is, calling to us to not be afraid. When Jesus called Peter to come to him on the water, Peter took Jesus up on his calling, just like he did when Jesus first called Peter to follow him. He didn't flinch. He just let go of that boat and found himself walking on the water with Jesus. And maybe that felt like a miracle to Peter. Maybe it was exhilarating and empowering, and maybe he felt like he really was with Jesus and he wasn't alone. Now, of course, it didn't last. The gospel says when he noticed the waves, he started sinking and called out to Jesus to help him, which of course Jesus did. Plenty of folks make sermons about Jesus' question of doubt and faith before Peter and Jesus joined the disciples in the boat, but I want us to look again at those disciples who had been in the boat watching Peter walk on the water with Jesus. What I find interesting is what isn't written in this gospel story, because scholars and commentators like to talk about the disciples who did not get out of the boat. Some accuse them of being afraid, unfaithful, and a few say they were downright lazy. Others say they were just smart to stay put. Some other scholars point out the boat was a symbol for the early church, and the story represents the early church suffering from the abuses of the world without Jesus in their midst, which gives us even more reason to pay attention when Peter and Jesus got into the boat with those disciples, because it tells us how to be church. The disciples didn't attack Peter with criticism, cynicism, or cruel comments. They didn't call him names or start lecturing him on what he should have done. Neither did they lift him up as a hero or exemplary disciple. Interestingly, they didn't acknowledge Peter at all. Instead, the focus of the disciples was on Jesus. And they didn't pester Jesus with questions or ask to walk on water themselves. Instead, they did something some would call religious. They worshiped him. Maybe Peter's walk on the water with Jesus wasn't something they watched dispassionately. Maybe it was something they were actually a part of by paying attention and by being there to welcome Peter back into the boat after Jesus pulled him out of that stormy water. Maybe they were as uplifting and supportive of Peter as the audience that watched Kyle sing on Britain's Got Talent. And that is why they knew they had been part of a miracle, all of them together. And that miracle was not Jesus' command over nature. It was how Jesus in the storm and Peter's willingness to go into the storm where Jesus was drew them all closer together as a community. And their response to being part of a miracle was to worship the one in its center, Jesus. Now there are many, many ways to interpret the miracle of Jesus walking on the water. But perhaps the best one for us today is the one that lets us look to the people in the boat who show us what it means to be the church in the world when the church is at its best. Sometimes there will be storms that will make us feel exhausted. At those times, it can be easy to think Jesus has abandoned us, is not with us, and to fear the worst. But when we look into the storm itself, whether that storm is a global pandemic, racism, poverty, or injustice, we might recognize Jesus in the midst of it. Now, we might not all feel called to go out into that storm, but those of us who do, those who are more proactive in issues on social justice, or those who are making sandwiches or distributing them for Wednesday lunch, or those who are trying new kinds of ministry or trying to adapt the ministries we've always done, we are the folks that we as a church can pay attention to, be present with, and support. And maybe it is these people that can help us all grow closer to God and each other, even if they sink and need us to help them regroup. Perhaps that is also part of being the church at its best, letting those who are called to go into the storm help us see Jesus. And when we support and love each other, like the audience supported a young singer on a TV show, that is when the beloved community of God's love becomes present. And that's the kind of miracle that can help us find peace in any storm and reminds us of who it is we worship, Jesus.